Have you ever wondered why someone can spend months convincing themselves they don't need you only to suddenly feel your absence when you're no longer there? It sounds contradictory, but it's one of the most misunderstood patterns in relationship psychology. The people who seem the most emotionally independent are often the last to recognize what they truly had. And by the time they do, the relationship has already slipped beyond their reach. Here's what most people completely miss. Avoidant individuals don't usually process emotional loss in real time. While an emotionally expressive person feels pain during conflict, an avoidant often feels relief first. Distance feels safe. Silence feels manageable. Independence feels like control. But emotions that are postponed are rarely emotions that disappear. They simply wait. Now imagine an empath entering that dynamic. Someone who notices subtle mood changes, offers patience instead of pressure, and constantly tries to understand rather than judge. At first, an avoidant may see those qualities as overwhelming, unnecessary, or even threatening. The very traits that make the empath valuable become invisible because they don't create immediate excitement, they create emotional safety. And emotional safety can feel unfamiliar to someone who has spent years protecting themselves from vulnerability. But here's where it gets interesting. Once that empath stops reaching out, stops explaining, and finally walks away, something unexpected begins to happen inside the avoidant mind. The silence they once wanted starts speaking louder than words ever could. Small memories become impossible to ignore. Ordinary moments suddenly carry emotional weight. Questions they never asked while the relationship existed begin demanding answers. Why does this happen? Why do so many avoidants seem to recognize an empath's worth only after losing them? Is it regret, loneliness, ego, or something much deeper rooted in human behavior and attachment psychology? By the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden psychological mechanisms behind this pattern, why it repeats itself in so many relationships, and what both avoidants and empaths can learn from it. Because once you understand what's happening beneath the surface, you'll never look at emotional distance or emotional connection the same way again. One of the biggest psychological blind spots in avoidant attachment is that emotional safety doesn't always feel safe. That may sound contradictory, but it's exactly where this relationship pattern begins. Most people assume an avoidant leaves because they don't care enough. In reality, many leave because they care just enough to feel emotionally exposed. And for someone who has learned to equate vulnerability with losing control, exposure can feel more dangerous than distance. Have you ever noticed how some people become uncomfortable precisely when a relationship starts becoming healthy? At first, they're charming, attentive, and fully engaged. But as trust grows, their behavior subtly changes. They become harder to reach, their replies become shorter. They begin focusing more on work, hobbies, or anything that creates emotional space. To their partner, it feels confusing. Nothing terrible happened. There was no major argument. Yet the connection slowly starts fading. Here's what most people completely miss. An empath often responds by trying harder. They communicate more clearly, ask thoughtful questions, and offer reassurance. Their intention is to strengthen the relationship. But inside the avoidant mind, every attempt to create closeness can accidentally activate an old survival strategy. Instead of hearing, "I'm here for you," they subconsciously hear, "You're expected to give more of yourself than feels safe." Imagine a couple who have been dating for several months. The empath notices their partner becoming quieter and gently asks, "Is everything okay? You seem different lately." It's a caring question, not an accusation. Yet the avoidant suddenly feels trapped by having to explain emotions they haven't even processed themselves. Rather than risk feeling exposed, they withdraw further. The empath interprets the silence as rejection, while the avoidant experiences it as temporary relief. Both people are reacting to the same moment, but through completely different psychological filters. This is where emotional intelligence becomes essential. The issue isn't that one person loves too much or the other loves too little. The issue is that they interpret closeness through different internal maps shaped by past experiences. Until those hidden patterns are recognized, each person's attempt to solve the problem unintentionally creates more distance. But here's where everything begins to change. Emotional distance may provide immediate comfort for the avoidant, yet that comfort comes with a hidden cost they rarely recognize until much later. And that delayed realization explains why losing an empath often feels so much heavier than leaving them. That brings us to the next psychological principle. One of the most fascinating truths about human behavior is that the brain often doesn't measure value by what is present. It measures value by what suddenly disappears. This is especially true for avoidance. While the relationship is still active, the emotional support, patience, and understanding of an empath become part of the background. They're so consistently available that the avoidance mind stops consciously recognizing their importance. But the moment that consistency is gone, the brain starts noticing what it once ignored. Think about how people react to silence. At first, an avoidant may experience relief when the constant emotional conversations stop. There are no difficult questions to answer, no expectations to meet, and no pressure to discuss feelings they struggle to name. It feels like they've regained control. But here's where it gets interesting. Relief is often a short-term emotion. Once the nervous system settles, the mind finally has room to process what was pushed aside. Have you ever noticed that memories often become stronger after someone leaves? That's because the brain naturally fills emotional gaps with reflection. An avoidant who once overlooked simple acts of kindness now begins replaying them in unexpected moments. They remember the partner who noticed when they were unusually quiet, who celebrated small victories, who sensed stress without needing an explanation. These weren't dramatic gestures. They were quiet forms of emotional security. And only after they're gone does the avoidant realize how much stability they created. Imagine an avoidant coming home after a difficult day. Months earlier, their empath partner would have recognized something was wrong just by reading their body language. They would have offered space without judgment or support without making the moment about themselves. Now the house is quiet. No message arrives asking how they're doing. No one notices the subtle shift in their mood. For the first time, the avoidant experiences not freedom, but emotional emptiness. The absence speaks louder than the presence ever did. This is a psychological blind spot that affects many relationships. People don't always appreciate emotional consistency while they have it because the human brain quickly adapts to reliability. It begins treating extraordinary care as ordinary. Only when that source of stability disappears does its true significance become obvious. But here's what almost nobody realizes. Recognizing someone's value doesn't automatically mean knowing how to reconnect with them. In fact, the very defenses that caused the separation often become even stronger once regret begins to surface. And that's the hidden conflict we'll explore in the next keynote. Here's where relationship psychology becomes even more complex. Most people assume that once an avoidant realizes what they've lost, they'll immediately reach out, apologize, and try to repair the relationship. But that's rarely how it works. Awareness and action are not the same thing. In fact, the moment an avoidant recognizes the depth of their loss is often the moment their internal conflict becomes strongest. Why? Because reaching out requires vulnerability. It means admitting they were affected, acknowledging mistakes, and risking rejection. For someone whose coping strategy has always been emotional self-protection, that can feel overwhelming. The same defense mechanisms that encourage them to create distance during the relationship now make it difficult to close that distance afterward. Have you ever noticed how some people suddenly become very active on social media after a breakup? They post achievements, travel photos, or moments that suggest everything is going perfectly. It's easy to assume they're simply happy and moving on. But human behavior often serves multiple purposes. Sometimes those actions are genuine. Other times, they're subtle attempts to restore a sense of control or to avoid confronting uncomfortable emotions. Outward confidence doesn't always reflect inner peace. Imagine an avoidant who unexpectedly hears that their empath partner is doing well. They're spending time with friends, pursuing personal goals, and no longer waiting for a message that never came. Instead of feeling relieved, the avoidant experiences something unexpected: uncertainty. They begin asking themselves questions they never considered before. Did I let go of someone who truly understood me? Will I ever find that kind of patience again? What if they no longer want me back? Those questions create emotional tension that can't be solved by simply staying distant. This is where emotional intelligence makes all the difference. Regret is valuable only if it leads to honest self-reflection. Without that, people often repeat the same behavioral patterns in future relationships. They may miss the person deeply, yet never address the habits that caused the loss in the first place. For the empath, this is an important reminder as well. Someone missing you doesn't necessarily mean they've grown. Genuine change is measured by consistent behavior, healthier communication, and a willingness to face uncomfortable emotions, not by temporary loneliness or emotional nostalgia. But here's where everything takes another turn. The greatest lesson isn't about whether an avoidant comes back. It's about why empaths often discover their own strength only after they stop chasing someone else's emotional availability. And that shift changes the entire relationship dynamic. One of the biggest turning points in these relationship dynamics has nothing to do with the avoidant. It happens inside the empath. For weeks or even months, an empath may believe that if they can just find the right words, show enough patience, or love deeply enough, the relationship will finally feel secure. They become focused on solving a puzzle that was never entirely theirs to solve. But here's what most people completely miss. The moment an empath stops chasing isn't always the moment they stop caring. More often, it's the moment they realize that love cannot replace another person's willingness to grow. That realization doesn't happen overnight. It usually comes after countless unanswered messages, repeated emotional cycles, and the exhausting experience of carrying the emotional weight of two people. Have you ever noticed how someone's body language changes when they stop seeking approval? They stand a little taller, their voice becomes calmer. They no longer rush to explain themselves or fill every silence. Confidence begins to replace anxiety because their attention shifts from controlling the relationship to understanding themselves. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about reclaiming emotional balance. Imagine an empath who used to check their phone every few minutes, wondering if their partner would finally respond. They replay conversations, question every word, and blame themselves for the growing distance. Then, slowly, something changes. They invest their energy into friendships, personal goals, and self-awareness. They stop measuring their worth by someone else's availability. When the avoidant eventually reaches out, they don't meet the same person they left behind. They meet someone who has learned to value their own peace. This shift often surprises the avoidant. During the relationship, they unconsciously expected the empath to remain emotionally available no matter how much distance they created. But when that emotional anchor is no longer waiting, the dynamic changes completely. The certainty they once relied on disappears, forcing them to confront emotions they had postponed for so long. This is one of the most important principles of healthy relationships. Emotional maturity isn't about convincing someone to choose you. It's about becoming someone who can walk away from unhealthy patterns without losing compassion. That's not emotional coldness, it's emotional wisdom. But here's where the psychology becomes even deeper. Why do some avoidants finally begin changing only after the empath has already moved forward? The answer lies in how human beings respond to certainty, uncertainty, and the loss of emotional security. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. One of the strongest forces in human psychology isn't love, it's uncertainty. As long as an avoidant believes the empath will always be there, there's very little pressure to question old habits. The relationship becomes something they assume they can return to whenever they're ready. That assumption creates emotional comfort, but comfort rarely challenges deeply rooted behavioral patterns. Everything changes when that certainty disappears. Have you ever noticed how people often begin reflecting only after they realize a door has truly closed? It's not because they're suddenly different overnight. It's because the brain pays much closer attention to potential loss than to familiar stability. This is known as loss sensitivity. We naturally feel the impact of losing something meaningful more intensely than we appreciate having it every day. Imagine an avoidant who reaches for their phone after a stressful day, expecting the empath to be just one message away. In the past, there was always a thoughtful reply, a patient conversation, or someone willing to understand without judgment. This time, there's silence, not as punishment, but because the empath has genuinely moved forward. That moment creates something the avoidant has been avoiding for years. Emotional accountability. Here's where body language and behavior often reveal more than words. Someone who once appeared completely unaffected may suddenly become unusually reflective. Ask mutual friends indirect questions, revisit old conversations, or find reasons to reconnect. These actions aren't always attempts at manipulation. Often, they're signs that the emotional reality has finally caught up with them. The feelings they delayed are now impossible to postpone, but here's what almost nobody realizes. Growth doesn't happen because someone experiences pain. Growth happens because they're willing to examine the beliefs that created the pain. An avoidant who simply misses the empath may repeat the same cycle in the next relationship. An avoidant who asks, "Why did I keep pushing away the very person who made me feel emotionally safe?" has begun a completely different journey. The same principle applies to the empath. Their greatest victory isn't making the avoidant regret losing them. It's learning that healthy love doesn't require constant emotional pursuit. It requires two people who are both willing to communicate, take responsibility, and grow together. And that brings us to the final keynote, the most important lesson of all. Because this story isn't really about who comes back. It's about what both people can become when they understand the psychology behind the pattern instead of repeating it. If there's one idea to remember from everything we've explored, it's this. The healthiest relationships are not built on one person constantly pursuing while the other constantly retreats. They are built on mutual emotional responsibility. That's the difference between surviving a relationship and truly growing within one. Many people watch a relationship end and immediately ask, "Will the avoidant come back?" It's a natural question, but it isn't the most important one. A far better question is, what has each person learned? Because without genuine self-awareness, people don't just lose partners, they repeat patterns. Different face, same dynamic. Think about what we've uncovered. The avoidant often mistakes vulnerability for danger, creating distance to feel safe. The empath mistakes patience for the solution, believing enough understanding will eventually create closeness. Neither intention is malicious. Both are trying to protect themselves in the only ways they know. But protection without awareness slowly becomes a prison. Have you ever noticed that the strongest relationships aren't the ones without fear. They're the ones where both people are willing to talk about that fear instead of letting it silently control their behavior. That's where trust is built, not through perfection, but through honesty. Imagine two versions of the same avoidant years later. In one future, they continue blaming timing, compatibility, or bad luck. They meet new partners, but every relationship follows the same familiar script: closeness, discomfort, withdrawal, regret. In the other future, they become curious instead of defensive. They learn to recognize emotional triggers before acting on them. They communicate discomfort instead of disappearing. They discover that vulnerability doesn't weaken healthy relationships, it strengthens them. The difference between those two futures isn't luck, it's self-awareness. The same transformation is possible for the empath. Instead of believing love means endless sacrifice, they begin recognizing that healthy compassion includes boundaries. They learn that understanding someone's wounds doesn't mean accepting repeated emotional inconsistency. Their confidence no longer depends on being chosen. It comes from choosing relationships where effort, respect, and emotional availability flow in both directions. This changes everything, because when both people become more emotionally intelligent, relationships stop feeling like emotional tug of war and start feeling like partnerships. The greatest value an empath leaves behind isn't guilt, it's perspective. And the greatest opportunity an avoidant receives after loss isn't another chance with the same person. It's the chance to become someone capable of protecting connection instead of protecting distance. The question, then, isn't whether losing an empath changes an avoidant. The real question is whether that experience becomes a temporary regret or a permanent lesson. The answer depends entirely on what they choose to do next. Every relationship teaches us something, but only if we're willing to pay attention to the lesson instead of focusing only on the outcome. If today's discussion has shown us anything, it's that people rarely lose meaningful connections in a single moment. More often, they lose them through patterns that go unnoticed until the silence becomes impossible to ignore. Avoidants don't always recognize an empath's value because they're heartless. Often, they struggle to recognize emotional safety while they're still living inside it. Empaths don't struggle because they care too much. They struggle when they believe caring alone can heal someone else's fear of vulnerability. Understanding these patterns isn't about assigning blame. It's about replacing judgment with insight. As you move forward, try observing behavior more than promises. Watch how people respond to trust, conflict, closeness, and accountability. Notice whether they become curious about themselves or defensive when challenges arise. Those small moments often reveal far more about the future of a relationship than grand romantic gestures ever could. Most importantly, remember that emotional intelligence isn't about learning how to control other people. It's about understanding yourself well enough that you stop participating in unhealthy cycles. Healthy relationships aren't created by finding a perfect partner. They're created when two imperfect people are both willing to communicate honestly, face uncomfortable truths, and grow together. Whether you identify more with the avoidant, the empath, or somewhere in between, let this be an invitation to become more aware of your own behavioral patterns. Because awareness is the first step toward change, and change is what turns painful experiences into lasting wisdom. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content. Until next time.